Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. So we are in our series talking about the language of justice. And on this episode, I want to talk about equality versus equity. Equality versus equity. There is a difference. And understanding the difference between these terms will determine what we actually advocate for when we fight for justice. Equity versus equality. There's a big difference. It's the difference between fighting for what they have or fighting for what you need. There's a difference. It's the difference between advocating for the same resources they have or advocating for the same opportunities and the same access that they have. There's a difference. It's the difference between demanding changes to how funding's allocated and demanding changes between how a system is operating. There's a difference. Equality versus equity. There is a difference. And we need to make sure that we're speaking the right language when we say what we need. The right language. The right language in the protests when we're speaking out. The right language in the conference room when you're demanding things to change and you need to see things done differently. The right language in council meetings when you're confronting policymakers and decision makers. We need to make sure we have the right language when we talk about these things. And so let's talk about it right now on this episode. Equality versus equity, right here on the Environmental Justice Lab podcast. Stay tuned. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. And on this episode, we're talking about the difference between equality and equity. Equality and equity. There's a difference. So when I was growing up, back in the day, my parents, when they were growing up, the conversation was about equality. We want equality, things to be equal. And that's because things weren't. When you looked at somebody's skin color, you treated them differently. Somebody's gender, you treated them differently. Somebody's immigration status, you treated them differently. That still happens today, but it was so egregious back then that the whole idea was we need equality. Treat me the same way that you would treat anyone else. That's what we were fighting for. That was the whole discussion, right? Equality, the definition, if you look it up, it'll say the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities, right? You want equal rights. You want equal protection. You want equal access. You want equal opportunities, right? We all want to be equal. That's the whole point. That's the whole goal in the end, is for everyone to be equal, right? So nobody is treated differently because of how they look or what they think. And we all have the opportunity to do the things that we're trying to do, being equal. And so it makes sense when you're confronted with inequality, when you can see clearly that one group is treated one way and this group's treated a different way. We don't want that. We want them to be treated equally. And so we were always talking about equality. We want equal for everyone. And it's fine. That's what we want in the end, ultimately, is equality across the board. No matter who you are, no matter where you're from, we want equality. But here's the thing. When you start talking about equality now, in 2024, after the Civil Rights Act, after the Voting Rights Act, after the Housing Act, after the Me Too movement in America here, after the Black Lives Matter movement in America here, After you have diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives all across the country, after you have all of these different programs that are designed to close gaps and close disparities, when you live in that world, the people who talk about equality are the ones who are pushing back against all of those efforts to make things better, more inclusive, and more equal across the board, right? So they'll say things like, you're giving preferential treatment to that quote unquote minority group when you do college admissions, when you do employment, because you're viewing their race or their ethnicity in a way that gives them privileges that the rest of the society doesn't get to enjoy. That's how people are talking about equality now. They're saying things like, hey, why do you want more than the rest of us? We should all want equal, right? We should all be treated equally, right? And so that becomes the way that people who don't acknowledge the history, don't acknowledge the inequality that exists, to try to weaponize the word equality to undermine efforts to actually bring about equality. See how that works? It's very, very crafty. You play with the language. And of course, we're right after MLK Day. So here in America, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the second Monday in January of every year. And every time we have that day, somebody who adamantly opposes any effort to make our society more equitable, more inclusive, more equal, more diverse, they'll come out and they'll say, hey, Martin Luther King Jr. said that he doesn't want anyone to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And when people say that, what they mean is stop giving treatment that prefers these minority groups, these marginalized groups above the rest of us who were here trying to do the same things. And what they fail to realize, or what they willfully ignore, is the fact that our current society is in and of itself unequal, and that we have to actually do work to make it equal. It doesn't just become equal by just pretending like history didn't happen and just letting everybody have the same things now. No, that's not how that works. We currently live in a state of inequality, and therefore we need to actually actively work to make it equal. And so that's why it's so important that our language reflects that. So we can't allow anyone to weaponize the word equality to undermine what we know is necessary for all of us to reach that level of equality that we've been striving for this whole time. We can't do that. And so now, in 2024, what I'm advocating for is a stronger, more deliberate use of the word equity. Equity is what we need. Equity talks about justice. Equity talks about removing any bias, any favoritism, anything that would privilege someone over another person. That's what equity does. It's a very active, very specific, very intentional way of addressing the wrongs that we've seen for so long in so many areas of our life. And on this podcast, as it relates to the environment specifically, we need equity, right? So people understand who use the word equity, they know that every person, whoever you are, wherever you are, particularly if you've been the recipient of racist policies, of xenophobic actions, of gendered inequality, you know that you start from a different place than everyone else, and that you are further behind than everyone else because of what was inflicted on your community. And so because of that, we have to actively do things differently. We need equity. We need specific, targeted resources to address the inequities that exist in your community, in our community, across the board. So it's not enough to just say, well, we used to give you $100 and you nothing for 100 years. You know what? You're right. We were wrong. We'll give everybody $100 now. That's not how that works. Your lack of investment in my community has left it starved for resources and devoid of opportunities because you have not actually put anything into it. And so now you have to go above and beyond to enable our community to be at the level where it's actually equal. So we need equity. That's what we need. The National Association of Colleges and Employers says that this process, this idea of equity, is ongoing, and it requires us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers that arise from bias or systemic structures. So think about that for 1 second. It's a process whereby we identify specific biases and specific structures and systems that contribute to the inequality that we see. And to bring equity into the conversation is to identify those and dismantle them, take them apart, take them down, because they are contributing to an unequal society. That's what that means. And so what does it look like? So if you are like me and you care about the environment and you care about how people experience the environment, the air that they breathe, the water that they drink, the way that waste is managed, the way their rivers and lakes and streams are protected. Well, we have to look at the structures and the people in power and how the policies they've enacted have influenced the way those things take place. How are air permits granted? How are water and sewer infrastructure, sewer systems managed and funded and maintained? Right? How is housing done? How are we doing transportation systems, roads, buses, interstates? Are we running them through certain neighborhoods in particular? Are we actually investing what we need to maintain our water infrastructure? Are we doing what's necessary to protect people's air quality? Or is the structure itself the problem? If it's not the structure, is it the people in those positions who have their own biases and have their own ways of viewing their population that lead them to do things in an unequal way? We have to look at that and figure out what that is. And when you, as an activist, as an advocate, for me as a researcher, I have to be well aware of these structures, of these biases. I can't close my eyes. I can't bury my head in the sand and pretend like they don't exist. They do exist. And because they exist, I have to make sure that whatever I'm doing or saying or advocating for keeps that in mind, so we have the right solutions to the problems. We have the right approach to addressing the issue. We change our language. So when the Flint water crisis happens, we don't just ask for more money to fix the water system. You ask for a way to change how the water managers in that city make decisions and how it impacts the people who live in Flint, Michigan. That's what you have to do. When you're in Jackson, Mississippi, and the flood comes that completely disables the water system where there's no water at all, not even water running through a faucet, you could say we need a certain amount of money to fix it, but you also have to ask the questions, why was this system so fragile to begin with? Who's making these decisions? How is money being allocated to the city to fund these projects? Who's in charge of making sure that these residents have what they need when they need it. And we learned just from the battle over the money that the state and the governor's office and Jackson and the mayor were at odds. And as a result, and I think they're at odds because Jackson's a majority Black city, which is also the capital of Mississippi, whereas the governor, he's a Republican governor. He had no interest in supporting what was going on in that city, used that state money for other purposes, even though he knew how bad those water and sewer systems were in Mississippi and Jackson. He did nothing to help. And so it's those kinds of biases, those types of structural issues that contribute to injustice, that contribute to these disparities. These disparities didn't happen on their own. And the people who deal with it didn't bring it on themselves. They're not just loosely living out here being reckless, and now their families are lower on the economic ladder, less educated, and have higher incarceration rates just on their own. These are not accidents. And in the environmental justice space, their air wasn't polluted by the people who lived there. It was polluted by industries and factories that came in. They're not managing their water systems. They're not the reason why there's lead coming out of the water pipes. It's not their fault. Somebody's responsible for that. There's a reason why this happens. There's a reason why there's so many more bacterial contamination events in Black communities than other communities in the United States. There's a reason for that. It's not an accident. It's not an accident. It's not an accident that migrant workers and immigrants from different countries are working in the worst conditions imaginable, and their children are also working in these conditions. It's not an accident. These things are not accidents. This is something that we have to make sure we're fully aware of. And when we talk about the issues, whatever the issues are, we make sure that we know what we're saying and what we're asking for, and being very specific about the needs and why those needs exist. We need equity. Equity. Don't spend your time and your energy in 2024 fighting for equality, for saying, hey, we just want the same things that they have. That's not what you need. You need very specific, very targeted investment that goes beyond what the general population has, because your needs are much greater because you have been abandoned or deliberately mistreated for generations. And so you need equity. That's what you need. That's what we need. I'm a professor at Benedict College. It's a small, historically Black college in Columbia. And I'm also a researcher at USC, University of South Carolina, which is the flagship university in South Carolina. And you can easily see the difference in the institutions, the resources, and everything that goes into making those two universities work. It's easy to see. And so if there's money available to build capacity, to build up these institutions, it's not enough to say, give both of those schools the same amount of money per student. That's not how that's going to work. What needs to happen is that Benedict College needs more per student because they've historically had less per student. They still graduate excellent, amazing students who do amazing things. I see them on TV. I see them in the community all the time. But it would be ridiculous if I walked up and said, yes, give each of these schools the same amount per student, make it equal. I would never say that because that's not what's needed. Equity is needed. These are the deficiencies. These are the issues. This is why these issues exist. And therefore, I need whoever makes the decisions to invest appropriately. That's what we need. We don't need equality at this point. We're trying to get to equality by you being equitable in how you operate and function as a state, as a city, as a whatever. That's what we're striving for. And that's what we're trying to do. So this is for anyone who is out there fighting because you know there's issues, you know there are problems. If you're an environmental justice activist and you see issues in the rivers and streams around you, the air quality is just awful and it's horrendous, don't look around and ask around and try to get equal resources or equal support or investment. You need to go in and you need to say, look, this is where we are. This is what we have. We need this amount, whatever that number is. We need these policies, whatever that policy is, for things to be equal. We need you to do that for this community, for this city, for this state. That's what we need. And it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of fighting, a lot of striving, a lot of sweat and anguish to move people to see that what's happened in the past has led to a point where there's such gross inequality and large disparities that it's going to take you a lot more to close it than just an apology and a commitment to make things equal now. We need more than that from you. And I'm going to do my part, whatever I can as a researcher, as a professor, to try to advocate for equity, because that's what's needed. We don't need the equality. We don't need the same. We need equity. When you apply to go to college and you know that people who look like you or have your sounding name has been historically excluded, it's time to say, look, you need to consider that reality when I apply. I know they're undermining affirmative action, they're undermining the use of race and ethnicity in admissions, and they're trying to extract it from our life and pretend like it never had an issue or that it now is not an issue whatsoever. And so we can just move forward, quote unquote, equally. But that's not how that works. You need to repair the damage. You know, if you are cutting holes in the bottom of my boat, it's not enough for you to say, I'm going to stop cutting the holes because I don't cut holes in anybody else's boat. So I won't do it for yours and you just stop. I need you to go back in and fix the holes and repair them so I can get back into the water. That's what we need. Repair so that we can actually reach a state of equality where everyone knows that they are being treated equally, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. That's what's needed. And anything less than that is not acceptable and will not achieve true justice and true equality for everyone. We need equity. That's what we need. And thanks for listening to this episode of the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.